it's not just isolated to that. The city of Seattle built their city hall to those green building standards, predicting that they would use 30% less energy than the old building, which was built 40 years ago. When they opened it up after the first year, they used 30% more. We saw this again and again. So the legislature this year, building on that success, they wanted to expand the program and pass a $3 billion bond of borrowing money that we would have to pay back in the future to implement these sorts of improvements across the board on schools and other state buildings that hadn't been improved in a while. And they claimed that part of the bonds would be paid back in the savings of these buildings. We brought our research down to Olympia. They weren't very happy to hear it, but ultimately the bill was killed, and so that died. That's the good news. The bad news, however, is that the federal government has decided that this is a good idea, and just a couple of days ago passed more than $6 billion for this very program nationwide. It's the first of its kind in the country. The advantage we have in Washington State is we have had to deal with this idea before anyone else, and so as a result, the research that we've done has been used all across the country. In fact, the National Center for Policy Analysis, in sending out research on the most recent congressional action, used the research that we did. So there's a good and a bad there. I guess we're becoming known because we're ahead, but we don't necessarily want to be ahead. But the second thing that we dealt with, which is climate change, and it was all climate change all the time in this legislative session. And the problem with climate change so often is it's not what you know, it's not what you don't know, it's what you know that ain't so. And let me tell you, there's a lot of stuff on climate change that we know that ain't so. So the Tacoma News Tribune had an editorial today because the Environmental Protection Agency is in Seattle tomorrow looking to promulgate some new global warming regulations. And the editorial today, written by somebody from the National Wildlife Federation, highlights all of the problems that we're going to see and are already seeing from climate change. And let me just read 3 of them. You will frequently hear environmentalists talk about the scientific consensus that exists on climate change. The irony, though, is that once they spit out those words, they ignore all of the science that that scientific consensus claims to represent. Let me say 3 things here that this gentleman wrote. He says, warmer temperatures are also to blame for the invasion of mountain pine beetles, which have already decimated over 32 million acres of forest in Washington and British Columbia. Wrong. I used to work for the Department of Natural Resources, which is the state's forestry agency. The Department of Natural Resources has been talking about mountain pine beetle infestation for decades. And the reason that we have mountain pine beetle infestation is because we have too many trees on the land. We have more trees per acre now than we did 100 years ago. There's a variety of reasons for that. One of them is we now fight fires, whereas fires 100 years ago used to clean out and leave very few trees. Big trees can fight off pests. Little trees can't. So we've seen mountain pine beetle infestation. You know who agrees with that? The environmental community. Well, 8 years ago they agreed with it. But they changed their tune now, and they now argue that global warming is the reason that we see mountain pine beetle infestation. So what was science to them 8 years ago is no longer science today. The other thing he writes is that the flooding of I-5 and other roads in December of 2007 cost more than $100 million in storm damage and freight-related losses. So what he's talking about here is the recent storms that we've seen, especially the one that really hit Centralia hard a couple years ago, is caused by global warming. Wrong. Atmospheric scientist Cliff Mass at the University of Washington, who's probably the most respected meteorologist in the area, looked at that and looked at the rate of recent storms and says there is no evidence, when you look at over the past decades, that there is any relationship between the temperature increase that we've seen in the past couple of decades and recent storms. He says he's tired. In fact, he wrote an op-ed in the Seattle Times that he's tired of people making these non-scientific claims. And yet you hear this again and again from the governor on down. Third, he says the future projections are even worse. In the lifetime of a child born today, sea levels could rise 3 to 6 feet. Wrong. The IPCC, which is the United Nations organization that represents the scientific consensus about climate change, their likeliest scenario is 14 inches. Not 3 feet, not 6 feet, not 10 feet, not even 20 feet, which you hear sometimes. 14 inches over the next century. Compare that to the fact that we saw 12 inches of sea level rise in the last 150 years. Is climate change going to increase sea level rise? Yes. How much? A few inches. But that's not what you hear. And And so when you see articles like this, people saying that they claim to represent the science, what in fact happens is they ignore all of the agreed upon science. There are arguments about whether that science is real or not, whether you should agree with the IPCC, but you would expect the people who say that they respect the UN and the IPCC to at least follow their science. Last thing I'll say is that this year there was a big fight over the climate change legislation. We pointed out some of the problems with the cap and trade system, the fact that Europe is not meeting their greenhouse gas reduction targets, the fact that the system is being gamed, that people are playing games and profiting from that rather than actually reducing CO2 emissions. We offered some alternatives, part of which was an incentive to capital investment, both to retool so that you have more efficient equipment, which everybody wants, but also to use that to create the technology that truly will make us more efficient so that we use less energy. That's what the market does. We are more efficient today than we were 10, 20, 30 years ago. And giving an incentive to technology is the way to solve this problem. And if you doubt that, imagine 20 or 30 years ago saying that there will be more people in the Puget Sound region driving more miles in bigger cars and air pollution will be half of what it was. Environmentalists would have said I was out of my mind. But it's true. And the reason it's true is because technology and innovation has more than kept up with that. And if we really want to solve these environmental problems, that's the path we'll choose. Thanks so much.